Apologize. Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us for this high-level panel event today entitled Exploring Ways Forward to Combat Spyware in the EU. My name is Asha Allen. I'm the Acting Director of the CDT Europe Office. And for those of you joining us online today not familiar with us, we are an international not-for-profit organisation based here in Brussels and in Washington, DC, that advocates for the preservation and respect for human rights in tech policy and law. Once again, thank you for joining our panel where we will be diving into the topic of the misuse of spyware technologies and the urgent need for regulatory action to address these abuses. Now, the Pegasus scandal sent shockwaves around the world, shedding light on the dangers of government surveillance enabled by modern technologies. Now, the European Parliament's PEGA committee uncovered the great extent to which EU governments have been using spyware surveillance against their own citizens, often for politically motivated reasons, for example, against journalists, politicians, activists, human rights defenders, and lawyers. And just last month, the Polish Ministry of Justice revealed that nearly 600 individuals were targeted with Pegasus spyware during the previous administration. So far, the response of the EU institutions has been underwhelming. Unfortunately, the European Council has refused to engage with the European Parliament's inquiry committee, and the European Commission has failed to take meaningful action in response to the European Parliament's recommendations. In contrast, however, EU member states have engaged with and supported other international initiatives aimed at setting up policy options to curtail the abuse of spyware, such as the Pall Mall process and the US-led joint statement on efforts to counter the proliferation and misuse of commercial spyware. Now, with the EU elections just around the corner, and with over half the world's population heading to the ballots this year, now really is the time for action and to set the new political agenda. So today, we will delve into how to approach this urgent need for regulatory action against the misuse of spyware technologies in the upcoming legislative term here in the EU, with a view to serve as guidance to incoming lawmakers and European civil society organisations who work to protect human rights. Therefore, we are truly honoured to introduce our panel of very distinguished speakers for today's event. I have the honour of being joined by four excellent panellists today. I will start by introducing Ms. Sophie in 't Veld, who is a current member of the European Parliament and has been since 2004, and was the rapporteur for the inquiry committee investigating Pegasus and equivalent spyware. We are also joined by Anna Bruchter. She's head of the unit for policy and consultation in the Office of the European Data Protection Supervisor, where she leads the work on providing advice on legislative proposals with a data protection impact. We're also joined by Mr. David Kaye. He's the professor of law at the University of California, Irvine, and is the former UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of opinion and expression. He is also the independent board chair of the Global Network Initiative. And last but certainly not least, we're joined by Ivana McGowan. She is the advisor on technology and human rights at the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and is also the former director of CDT's Europe Office. Thank you so much to you all for joining us today. It's a true pleasure to be joined by you all. I wanted to start with an opening question posed to you all, and that is, how can democracies in Europe and the world first start addressing this issue of the illegal use of spyware? And what do you think governments could do to curtail the proliferation of spyware? Sophie, if I may come to you first.
Yes, thank you. Well, I don't think it's so difficult. I think they know what they have to do. The problem is they don't want to do it. I think there have been lots of good suggestions from many sides, and the report of the European Parliament gives them a whole toolkit to address the issue. But the political will is just not there, because they're a little bit, they kind of like their little toy, and they're very reluctant to give it up. And then signing up to the international initiatives that you mentioned Yeah, that's a bit for the gallery. It's a bit like, telling the rest of the world that they shouldn't abuse spyware and then continue to use it themselves and also export it to other parts of the world. So the first ingredient that we need is political will.
Thank you very much. And I think that's quite a clear message on what's needed there. Anna, if I can come to you next for the same question.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you very much for this invitation. I think a first condition to me would be not treat this as business as usual. I think even because it's also maybe not entirely fair to throw all governments and all countries into the same basket, but even sometimes where we see certain attempts by politicians to devise legal frameworks or approaches how to handle this, how to use these technologies, I think today nobody really is discussing a general moratorium or a ban any longer. There is a temptation to just see this as yet another lawful intercept technology. We've seen many of them before. Technology evolves. This is just another tool in the belt of, for example, law enforcement authorities and other agencies. And as EDPS, since the very early days, we have tried to make the point that it's not just yet another tool. This is a paradigm shift. It brings the intensity and the seriousness of interference with the private life to such a level that really cannot be compared to a traditional interception of communication. So this particularly intrusive and dangerous character of these tools needs to be recognized. And I think only on this basis can we really have a proper discussion. And if I may add just one last sentence, we should also be mindful of the fact that European states in particular are already under a number of international law obligations, European Convention of Human Rights, the Convention on Personal Data Protection 108, updated recently, so known as Convention 108 Plus. So we are not operating, nobody is operating in a legal vacuum, and there is a number of obligations that are already, that should be complied with.
Thank you for that, Anna. And you touched upon those important points about the obligations in the international sphere, which allows me to pose the question here to Averna. Your thoughts on this initial question here on what governments could do to curtail the proliferation of spyware?
Thank you very much, Asha, and hello to everybody here joining us. So the Office of High Commissioner has already been very clear in calling globally for a global moratorium and halt in the sale and transfer of such spyware until such a time that effective regulation can come in place, but also bearing in mind, as was rightly mentioned by Anna, that some of this spyware, by their very nature, will not be capable of being compatible with human rights. The need to be prescribed by law, but also not to go beyond what's necessary in the context of an investigation, that question of proportionality that Anna was also referring to. So I do think that certainly, I mean, flipping a little bit on its head, clearly we do need extra regulatory measures to really ensure accountability, remedy and halting this proliferation of spyware. And at the same time, actually existing international human rights law is really clear on what the specificities are in terms of lawful surveillance. So there's really an argument there as well that within states existing obligations, they should be taking action. But I also, of course, hear very much what MEP Veld speaks to, when sometimes the challenge itself can be political will, and then maybe we can speak later when political will doesn't work. There's also, of course, other avenues of accountability through legislative action and litigation and other measures.
Thank you so much. And we will definitely go deeper into how to navigate in a vacuum of political will. But David, I wanted to come to you for your thoughts on this initial reflection.
Great. Thank you, Asha. And thanks for having me on this panel with such great people. And the truth is, I agree with everything that's been said. So, trying to think about, what in addition I could add to the excellent interventions already, I guess I would say two things. The first is it's pretty clear that that spyware causes very serious interference with human rights. I think Anna put it well, like exceptionally well. And so the question is, what should states do about that? And so I think one step that states should take, and I think Sophie is exactly right, this is a political will question. They should be very clear about their own restrictions on the use of spyware. And, this can be done in a variety of ways. It can be done, obviously, by the commission as a whole, but it can be done state by state, whether it's a question of law or it's a question of sort of forswearing any use of this tool. I think would send a really important message globally. Frankly, it's a message that doesn't come through, for example, in the Media Freedom Act, which provides a little bit of sort of potential value in these tools, at least in certain circumstances, although we could talk about that later. So that's one thing, is just actually, constraining the tools themselves. And the other is an export issue. And it's being much clearer, right, about the rules. I think Europe has come some way, really under the leadership of Sophie and the PEGA committee and everything that she's done in this space. But there's always more that can be done there. And we'll talk a little bit later about what the US has done. I think some of the steps that we've seen there can probably be internationalized in a way.
Thank you so much. And I think if we pivot and look to those lessons learned from the processes that are led by Sophie, as you mentioned there, and how we can bring that into the international forum, we'll definitely get into those conversations later on. But Sophie, I did want to come to you with our next question, because I really wanted to delve a little bit deeper into the EU's response following the adoption of the PEGA report. What immediate next steps were expected after the PEGA inquiry? And as we've already touched upon, what are your reflections on how governments and the EU institutions have reacted as they were called on to by the European Parliament? Do you think we can expect the EU institutions after the elections to take up your recommendations?
I hope so. No, yeah, okay. I'll respond to a couple of things that were said, and at the same time, that's also a reply to your question. First of all, Anna said, this is a responsibility, or not all member states are equally bad. Some are more bad guys than others. I tend to disagree, because it's true that not all EU governments abuse spyware against citizens for political purposes. But they have collectively decided not to address the issue. Collectively, there is a collective responsibility, a collective silence, and they have collectively refused to take action. So that means that they may point the finger at another member state government, but if they all collectively block action, then they're all equally bad. They're all complicit, all of them. Secondly, on what action can be taken with regard to the suggestion of litigation, yes, but we have seen that's almost impossible, because it means that an individual who has been targeted, who is unlikely to get information from the very government that has been targeting him, has to go to. We have seen to date. I don't think there's been a single case that has been resolved through litigation. And we see that in Poland, indeed, now, bit by bit, the information is becoming available. But in the meantime, the government is left, and the damage has been done. So, and I don't think it is reasonable for us to expect individual citizens who have no tools to solve this issue via litigation, which is not to say that we shouldn't explore the avenue of litigation. I'm a big fan of strategic litigation, but I don't think it's actually going to solve the issue. With regard to exports, it underlines perfectly what the problem is. We have very clear export regulations. That's not the problem. The problem is they're being violated deliberately and systematically, and the Commission flatly refuses to enforce the rules, flatly refuses. And they now have this new mantra also in other areas. I mean, the Commission refuses to enforce in all areas, I have to say. And they say, oh, but it's for the member states, for the national authorities to apply the law. And if they don't, somebody has to go to court. And that means that, the Commission basically denies having any responsibility at all in enforcing the law. So this is becoming a big problem across the board, and not just with regard to spyware, but with any policy area that you can think of. If all the authorities which are responsible for applying the law refuse to apply the law, then you have very little tools left. And what I would hope for is that the next European Parliament is going to be a lot tougher in holding the European Commission to account. Because frankly, I mean, there's been, in my view, over the last 5 years, there have been many reasons to send the von der Leyen Commission packing, but this is one of them. I mean, the Commission flatly refusing to enforce the export regulations when spyware is being exported from the European Union with the consent, or actually facilitated by national authorities, and spyware is being used for human rights violations. I mean, how much more do you need to call for the resignation, at least of a commissioner, if not of the whole Commission? That means that we need a European Parliament which feels this responsibility of holding the Commission to account, and that unfortunately was absent in the last 5 years. So ultimately, you can have all the rules in the world, but without the political will and without political courage, it's not worth anything. It's just paper. So this is something that we need to address.
Thank you so much for those insights, Sophie, and really wanted to pick up on the points there you made about collective responsibility and collective accountability, but more so also this question on the actions of the European Commission in the immediate term after the publication of the report. And so, Anna, if I may, I just wanted to come back to you on this, because the European Commission has been adamant and clear that from their perspective that existing EU standards are solid enough. And that beyond that, the exclusive competences of member states would apply. So the question here is, are EU member states and countries in general, I think we can talk about this in the international scope later on, but are EU member states justified in claiming that this is a subject of national security?
Well, let me start by saying that I speak here as a lawyer and not a politician. So I will give you a typical lawyer's answer. It depends, in the sense that indeed there are parts of state activities, and we are all aware that intelligence, counterintelligence, and other security bodies that operate in the national security sphere traditionally have had access and have had used tools that were maybe not necessarily available to ordinary law enforcement, quote unquote. And so this is very likely not different in the cases of Pegasus and similar very intrusive modern spyware. And when it comes to such matters of national security, indeed, there isn't a lot EU institutions can do, because member states invoke the exemption from the treaty, Article 4.2 of the Treaty on the EU, that indeed leaves these matters entirely within the jurisdiction of the member states. At the same time, already since many, many years, there is a body of case law of the Court of Justice that has been built in other areas than electronic communications or privacy, where the court has repeatedly clarified that this exemption cannot be treated as a blank check. So it's not enough to simply say, oh, it's national security, for this to escape any scrutiny, including from the Court of Justice. And very helpfully in recent years, we have had discussions about how far this exemption extends specifically in the context of confidentiality of electronic communications and the long-standing debates in the EU that we have around the retention of traffic data, retention of metadata. So there, the Court of Justice has clarified that whenever in the process of deploying any such obligations related to confidential or impacting confidentiality of communications, whenever state bodies or the state needs to rely on service providers, on private operators, or impose any obligations on them, that in itself would bring the matter within the scope of EU law and would be subject to jurisdiction of the court. Now, of course, this condition may or may not be fulfilled, depending exactly about which type of spyware or tool we are talking. Unfortunately, from my perspective as a data protection authority, it would seem to me that in many cases, state agencies do not really go through any type of provider to deploy this type of technical tools, which would still seem to suggest that we don't have the hook it to European law. It would still remain within this exemption for national security, but it may not be the case for everything, for every situation. So a careful analysis would need to be done, and at least in some cases, it seems to me there would be an argument could be made that this indeed falls already within the scope of EU law, and that the member states cannot just hide behind the treaty exemption. But there is another part to it, and this is that obviously we know that this type of software is also used in the context of law enforcement. And paradoxically, it's the EU itself that has provided the best illustration or demonstration of that. So something that David has already mentioned here, the recently adopted so-called European Media Freedom Act, under the guise or pretense of harmonizing conditions for protection of confidentiality of communications of journalists and their sources, in fact, enacted sweeping grounds for derogations for member states, specifically for use of Pegasus type intrusive software and spyware against journalists. So this is something that, again, as EDPS, we have been calling out the dangers of this approach since the very beginning, since the proposal was first put out. Some additional conditions and safeguards were included in the final text. We, however, are still extremely worried that this will constitute a very dangerous precedent, precisely almost an illustration how not to go about it, treating this type of spyware almost as a yet another tool in the belt of law enforcement authorities, and frankly, including this type of regulations in an internal market instrument without a proper democratic societal debate, without any discernible link to ongoing discussions in international fora, and providing sweeping grounds for exceptions, situations where such spyware could be used against the fourth estate, some of the most important groups that merit the highest level of protections. I personally find it quite shocking, and I do hope that there will be follow-up, hopefully constitutional level scrutiny by courts and by the Court of Justice of these provisions, if ever any member state decides to rely on them. I would not recommend it because I believe it rests on extremely shaky legal ground. So let's hope that it will not, that the damage will not be lasting. But to answer your question again, it shows that increasingly these tools are also perceived as something that can be used in relatively minor cases, not to say routinely, by law enforcement. And that would bring it squarely within the scope of EU law, of course, and applicability of the law enforcement directive, so the directive on data protection in law enforcement, with all its inherent limitations and imperfect transposition and implementation. But at least there would be a legal framework to tackle some of the challenges.
Thank you so much for the in-depth insights there, Anna. And I think that you raised so many important aspects there in terms of thinking about the sweeping derogations that we might see and how these exemptions, come into play in practice, even though some legislations you've mentioned, the European Media Freedom Act, and there are others in which safeguards were attempted. But of course, we can see in reality what may be the result here. And this question of the subject of national security coming in as a justification. I want to take that actually beyond the scope of the European Union, because I think it's come up in many different forums and many different jurisdictions. So maybe David and Ivana, I don't know if you had any also reflections you wanted to share on this question on whether countries in general are justified in claiming this subject of national security and maybe thinking about those in practicality.
Ivana, you want to take that on first, or so it's a great question, but I think we need to back up slightly in thinking about the potential uses of intrusive spyware and start with, I think where the discussion started earlier, which is that because of the nature of the tool, its extraordinary interference with individuals, with their privacy, with everybody's access to information, because of the nature of the tools and their ability to chill the work of journalists or the willingness of sources to join. Because of that extraordinary interference, we need to be thinking about restrictions in a slightly different way. In other words, this isn't a question of just a normal interference with expression, right? So every interference with expression or privacy has to meet the three-part test of legality, necessity and proportionality, and legitimacy. But when you have an interference that is so extraordinary, the basis for any restriction must also be extraordinary. It must be a very high bar. And I think the question that is raised by spyware, and I think this is because of the nature of the technology itself, right? The ability of the technology to, in a way that is very, very difficult to track, right? So unlike a normal wiretap, for example, where it's relatively, at least comparatively easy to track the use of the tool and what it collected, it's extraordinarily difficult to do that with intrusive spyware like Pegasus. So in that light, I think it is a real question for us to think about whether there's any potential ground, national security or public order or otherwise, that justifies the use of a tool because of the extraordinary harm that it can cause. So I think the burden is on the users of the technology, the clients of NSO, for example, to publicly provide evidence that the use of the tool actually achieves a legitimate objective. And it's on them as well to justify or to demonstrate that it's a tool that generally, assuming all the facts, generally could be available as a national security tool. And so far, states have not done that. NSO Group does it, but states seem embarrassed by the argument almost. They recognize, I think, that making the argument is extremely difficult to do. So, there's a long way of answering the question. I've always been open to an argument that the three-part test, including a legitimate objective, could be met. but I haven't seen the case made for it. And I think the bar for reaching that, for making that argument, is just should be seen as very high.
Thank you for those insights. And I think we'll definitely go a little bit deeper into the discussion on interferences with rights protections like freedom of expression and press freedom and privacy, and what bar needs to be met there. But before we do, I wanted to give Sophie or Ivana a chance to also reflect on this question about kind of the justification or so-called justification around national security in this context.
Yes, thank you. Because I'd like to challenge a little bit this automatic assumption that the fact that national security is a purely national competence, that translates into the absolute and unilateral right of member states to create basically an area where the normal rules don't apply anymore at all. It's not even just about national security activity still being coming into the area of EU law, because we know that's also the case with e-privacy and the Charter of Fundamental Rights applying. But there's also in Convention 108, and it was Professor Van Eyck who pointed that out, the obligation for member states to ensure independent oversight, which almost none of the member states does. Almost none. I mean, maybe the Netherlands, but they're dismantling it as well. So there, some rules do apply. And the European Commission itself, in its initial letter to the member states, says this right to shape national security is not absolute. It doesn't mean it's not a blank check for member states. So that's what the Commission said in its letter, but it then doesn't define where the boundaries are. And I think if a government is spying on an opposition politician, then by definition, that's not a matter of national security. The use of spyware for political purposes, by definition, cannot qualify as national security. So I do think, I recognize that it's a difficult issue, but and that this is why in the European Parliament resolution we have recommended that, or we've called actually for a demarcation or a definition of national security, or in any case, let's say European standards, which doesn't mean that member states cannot shape and run their own national security structures, but that they are bound by certain rules. But even until that's the case, we cannot just say like, oh well, it's national competence, therefore member states can pretty much do what they like, and there's very little we can do. If the Commission itself, in its question to the member states, says this national security exemption is not absolute and unlimited, it means that the Commission assumes there are limits and that the Commission has the tools to intervene, but it's not intervening. And I also think that again, here you run into this brick wall of the political refusal to act. I think this analysis should also have been made by the Council. They haven't. And it is very obvious. You also saw that in the negotiations around the Media Freedom Act, the member states have absolutely no intention of regulating themselves. They don't want to. They want to have the freedom to use the stuff. They want to have the freedom to use spyware in any way they deem fit, without anybody looking over their shoulder and checking whether it's in line with our values. And one final argument: whatever they do, national security being national competence and all the rest of it, it will still have to be in line with the treaties, in particular Article 2. A government using spyware to eliminate scrutiny, to eliminate opposition, to eliminate criticism and accountability, that's not a democracy anymore. So they don't even meet the standards laid down in Article 2. So I don't think that we're entirely powerless. But of course, what we're up against is a trend which we see globally, whereby the executive, i.e. the governments, get more and more and more powers. They have more and more and more tools to control the citizens and to escape scrutiny. We see that the scrutiny bodies, like the parliament, which is supposed to control the government and not the other way around, but also independent oversight bodies, the media, the opposition, public scrutiny by citizens, by NGOs, by academics, all of that is weakened more and more. And that is why it's so incredibly important that the European Parliament, the next European Parliament, at the very least, is going to take its responsibility and actually force the European Commission to do its duty of enforcing the law.
Thank you so much. And you raised so many important points there about those kind of mechanisms of accountability and duty to abide by those existing standards. I did want to come to that question on accountability, and Ivana, I wanted to come to you in a moment if I could, but before I did that, I did want to come back to this question of the existing EU legislation, because the European Media Freedom Act has been mentioned several times already. We also have the Data Protection Acquis here in the EU, and there are other legislative frameworks that we have that provide certain safeguards and protections for things of fundamental rights, such as privacy, freedom of expression, and press freedom. So Anna, if I may very quickly come back to you, would you be able to clarify for us how the use of spyware actually interacts with existing EU legislation? For example, those elements that I outlined in particular.
Yes, so very briefly, once again, I think as Sophie and others have rightly pointed out, there are some instruments of international law, in particular the European Convention of Human Rights, but also the Convention 108 plus, specifically on data protection, that are binding, apply in all the member states of the EU, have some enforcement mechanisms. A body of case law from the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg is actually perhaps potentially even more insightful when it comes to matters of national security and confidentiality of communications than the body of case law from Luxembourg, which has its obvious limitations because of the more narrowed scope. So this applies in any event, and I suppose that whenever the Commission makes references to legal frameworks that exist, this might be a big part of what they have in mind. This is, however, not necessarily EU law. Here we run into the problem again of the treaty. And once again, it should not be just taken at face value. There should be some analysis on case-by-case basis whether the conditions for invoking the exemptions for national security are really applicable. And yes, indeed, member states should probably be reminded regularly that even if they could try to argue that the Charter does not apply, that the GDPR does not apply, that the Law Enforcement Directive does not apply, they are still bound by very much equivalent obligations of these other instruments, which do apply in all areas without exception, including national security and related activities of the state. So I think that this is the first point. And then, well, to the extent that we would be operating within the scope of EU law, so let's assume use of intrusive spyware within the traditional law enforcement activities of prevention, detection, prosecution of hopefully only serious crimes. Then we have a more specific legal framework, at least for privacy and data protection in place with the Law Enforcement Directive. The guarantees of the Charter obviously apply as well. GDPR obligations to the extent that it's, about securing the data by providers and controllers, etc. But even, and last but not least, I should also mention the e-privacy directive that has never been replaced so far by the e-privacy regulation. That is, by the way, also stuck somewhere in the legislative limbo because of some discussions on national security and data retention related matters. But it does include certain, well, at least a legal framework for the member states or the union to adopt legislation to allow for interferences with confidentiality of electronic communication. So this is undoubtedly also applicable. However, as with the GDPR, any European instrument for data protection or privacy protection, they quite often act more as an enabling, so like rules of the road. What do you need to do to, you know, to process data, or what conditions to allow for the interference? And here I would agree with those co-panelists who have hinted that maybe we should have a discussion first and foremost whether such tools could be lawfully deployed in the first place. And if so, only in very, very exceptional circumstances. So that has been our EDPS stance for a very long time, that we should not be satisfied that, you know, we have all these general rules that would apply anyway, whether it's traditional lawful intercept or something else. We should really have a think whether this type of intrusion, or when, under what conditions, under what circumstances can it be justified. And even if the case could be made that sometimes it could be beneficial, necessary, proportionate outside of the national security remit, that to us, well, that's already a big question. That would require very detailed regulations with very high level of safeguards. And we would argue that it should always be a very exceptional occurrence where nothing else can be used effectively. But precisely because of the level of intrusiveness, and to draw a parallel again with long-standing discussions in the EU around data retention that maybe some in the audience might be familiar with. The simplest argument why this is so intrusive is, well, because we've had all these discussions and dilemmas around traffic data, metadata, you know, but as long as it comes to access to content of communications, the courts have always drawn a very clear red line saying this is the essence of the right to privacy. If someone can, on generalized basis, read your communications, this is a completely different ballgame than just in inverted commas looking at metadata, which can be intrusive enough. And here we are talking about tools that grant complete access, not just to contents of communications, but to everything which is on a mobile device, on a smartphone, which is, you know, for all practical purposes, our entire lives. So there, I think the argument about inherent lack of proportionality, or rather, as we phrase it under the Charter, you know, the seriousness of this interference is so big that it potentially compromises the essence of the fundamental rights to privacy and data protection. And so the moment this happens, there is no need, there is no point in debating whether it is necessary or proportionate. It just cannot be remedied, even with additional safeguards. And I think that this is the starting point of the discussion that we actually should have, especially if it is being considered to somehow regularize or allow use of such tools outside the national security context, but as an almost routine tool to be used by law enforcement.
Thank you so much for those reflections and those fundamental questions that these raise, right, in terms of whether that bar can be met, if the question of the legality of their use is at the very foundation of this. And you mentioned we're talking in the EU context here, but you did mention the binding nature of other frameworks that those EU member states are obliged to, including the UN Convention on Human Rights, and the questions that it brings around the accountability that they have to those mechanisms. So, Ivana, I wanted to come back to you, if I may, to get your thoughts and your reflections on what does accountability actually look like in this context of spyware, especially with how complicated of a structure that we're looking at here, specifically looking at things like the avenues to justice and remedy for victims, as we've touched upon, for those residing in the EU or internationally, and how can we ensure that justice is accessible for victims of transnational repression enabled by spyware?
I get the easy question. Thank you. And I think actually, Asha, this question of accountability and access to remedy, that's what we're all talking about today. That's really the core of the issue. And, it links back to the point that Sophie rightly made about how can people go through the courts for the past violations. There's a number of different elements related to, for me, when you talk about accountability, you have to think about what and how is the right to effective remedy. Obviously, if you don't know in the first place that you were subject to such surveillance, how can you access remedy? Obviously, even if you do happen to know and seek that remedy, if the intrusion was such, as other colleagues have pointed out as well, then actually your effective remedy would be really out of reach. So I think it always brings us back to this more broad question under those international human rights law obligations that you mentioned. The starting point should be that any such surveillance should use the least intrusive measure. So we're back to this conversation about the very nature of how the spyware is deployed and what they do. So the least intrusive measure. Then it should obviously only be restricted to the most serious crimes. And if ever, would really have to be targeted, not go on what's necessary. And you do need that point about notification after the fact, especially in cases where there might have been a wrongful surveillance. And I know there has been some jurisprudence in the European Court of Human Rights on this whole question of notification, a notification after the fact. There is a big question, I think, of the legacy now we have, thanks to the very powerful work by a lot of international not-for-profit organizations of exposing just the extent to which people had been targeted. There's a really deep question about what are the actual avenues for meaningful. I mean, maybe that's the problem, that the intrusiveness was so much, the invasion was so much that it's very hard to totally remedy that after the fact, which is one of the reasons that we do have to really look forward and challenge this question. National security was talked about extensively. I'm compelled to actually mention, because I believe it's tomorrow, that there will be also, of course, a vote on the Council of Europe's Convention on Artificial Intelligence. And there, the debate in Strasbourg is on this point as well. And unfortunately, in the draft text, at least, there's currently a national blanket national security exemption. The jurisprudence of international human rights law is very clear. Blanket exemptions won't pass the test, because obviously in certain cases that can totally block any access to remedy or accountability. So I do think that going forward, we really need to think carefully. Also, as difficult as that can be in different jurisdictions at the national level, export controls, again, we've seen about how some of them have worked or not in practice, depending on the political will. But export controls, in order to come into play, they have to cross a border. And there is an increasing trend of different governments, for that very reason, developing their own national capacities to do so, which means for a real accountability perspective, we also need to think about what can happen at national level in different ways to ensure that really meaningful accountability. And I'm speaking for different at different corners around the world. I do believe that there have been some avenues, notwithstanding the great barriers to accountability, which is why we need further regulation and indeed a moratorium, as the Office of High Commissioner has called for. But I do think there might be ways to use existing laws to think creatively, as I said, because there are existing rights that have been violated in certain contexts that we might need to think about how access to justice can be. But obviously a major hurdle, which is why we're having this conversation, is that the use of spyware inherently interferes with that accountability point on the access to effective remedy.
Thank you so much for those reflections. And it keeps bringing us back to this question of the legality of use and those tests and whether it can be achieved in this context when we're thinking about these questions and the kind of infinite safeguards that would need to be in place, which would kind of undermine that process. But you did touch upon looking at things in that international fora and thinking, and we've talked quite a lot about the need for political will and where there has been political action. And I wanted to pivot our conversation to where there has been some action and come over to David, if I may, because in the United States, the administration has been leading action against spyware vendors in a way that may be described as exemplary compared to other countries in the world and EU democracy. So, for example, sanctions, travel bans, visa restrictions, and kind of multi-country joint declarations on this. So my question to you is, do you think there can be lessons learned from this particular process, and how can cooperation between the two regions against the fight against spyware be advanced?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure I would use the word exemplary necessarily, but I do think there's been quite a bit of progress over the last couple of years in terms of what the United States has been doing. And for those who are listening who aren't familiar with it, it's not as if the United States has adopted, a kind of three-part test way of looking at spyware. Instead, they've done a couple of things that I think are very interesting. So the first thing is a kind of conceptual framing. So the United States, a couple of years ago, when an executive order was adopted on the subject of spyware, it basically said that intrusive spyware is a human rights threat in much similar terms that we've been talking about it, but they also said it's a national security threat. And that came from actual evidence that the United States government had that US diplomats, sometimes foreign service nationals, were actually targeted with Pegasus or tools like Pegasus. And I think that kind of framing, that kind of conceptualizing of what the problem is pretty important, because, it's one thing for us to make the argument that it's a human rights harm to use these tools. And it absolutely is. Like, I wouldn't, move away from that at all. But I think it resonates with governments in a different way when you say, look, the proliferation of these tools without constraint isn't merely a problem for, people outside of your country or for journalists who aren't necessarily the most popular constituency for politicians in some places, but it's actually also a national security threat. So I think, on that front, that framing has been really important, and the fact that the U.S. framing in the context of its kind of leadership of these statements alongside the summits for democracy have been really important, because they make that kind of conceptual point clear. The other part of it is, what has the United States been doing unilaterally? It has been, I think, again, I don't know if I'd say exemplary, but it has been, very forthcoming in identifying those actors, so like NSO Group, but others as well, who are using these tools in a way that actually undermines democratic foundations or national security of the United States. And they've done it in, I think, a pretty transparent way. And I think to a certain extent that is a model for other states or for the Commission, frankly, to look at how the US has taken sort of the conceptual arguments and then said, look, we have evidence of real threat, and we're going to take action against those states or those companies that are developing and selling these tools. Now, there's more you can do, of course, but that's a pretty good step. And I think there's a lot of room for European states, the Commission, and others to follow that kind of an approach. But the other thing I think that's valuable to look at here is that the way that the United States has done this has been to say, essentially, we have evidence. I mean, this is a fact-based approach, and I think I'm sure this is happening, but it's important for it to happen in a robust way, which is the U.S. and Europe can share information about what they're seeing, not only in terms, again, of the human rights harms, because civil society has done an amazing job at highlighting the human rights harms by spyware. Citizen Lab, Amnesty Tech, Access Now. I mean, they've done, and others have done, just tremendous work at uncovering these specific cases. But states see different kinds of national security threats. And I think they need to be, again, I'm not saying they're not, but it's something that we should be encouraging them to do, which is talk to one another, share evidence of threats, share evidence of networks, of manipulation, using information that's taken from these kind of uses of these tools. I think that's a place where, at least my sense is that European intelligence services are happy to have that kind of conversation. They just need to take the next step, which is, okay, we have the information, we need to take action against these actors so they don't have safe havens in our jurisdictions as well.
Thank you for sharing those. And there are some very concrete lessons, I guess, to be learned there. And we can talk about whether they are exemplary or not, or what can be taken and what may be useful in different contexts. I wanted to give Ivana a chance, actually, if you had any reflections on this in terms of those lessons learned. I mean, we've looked at the US, but if there are any others in the international fora that you think could also be applicable in this context.
So, I mean, it's clear with the exception of a few maybe international processes that haven't been as binding, the processes you referred to, the dual use regulation, of course, in the European Union, the executive order from the Biden administration as well. So I would agree. I think the points that David made are very interesting. Maybe just one additional point that I think speaks to the effective implementation of export control regimes generally is this whole question that keeps coming up about effective human rights due diligence. Because we know, for example, with some, with a number of export control regimes, that if the language is too vague or doesn't actually follow the UN guiding principles of human rights or the principle of due diligence more broadly, what does it really mean? For example, if you're exporting, what does it really mean either for the state that's issuing the license or the company that's involved in the proliferation? I think there's enough evidence now in terms of the work of the treaty bodies, the special rapporteurs internationally, the Office of Commissioner and others. We can't claim that there's a lack of information of the context in a given country of what's going on the ground. And so sometimes you see these kind of extraordinary cases whereby there's a claim that a due diligence process has been carried out, and at the same time you've seen an export into a country where the context is, very adverse for human rights. So I do think that component, and maybe something that should be an area of common discussion between the EU and the US as well, is really looking at the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, the UN guiding principles. I know that the EU's own due diligence laws are not actually applicable in the tech sphere per se, unless it's in a particular context. But we're just so much further along in terms of the internationalization of the concept of human rights due diligence than we were many years ago. So I think really thinking really how that can be given more teeth. I mean, we're better thought out. And I also understand that as part of the updating of the EU's dual use regulation, this was one of the questions about the guidance on due diligence and other questions as well. So obviously that could be, I think, an area of more collaboration and more thought, given that those conversations internationally, the norms have really shifted. And I think we need to think about how it applies in this context.
Thank you so much. And that question of international collaboration, looking at existing guidelines in international fora such as the OECD guidelines and others, allows me to come to the next question on a very specific process. And David, if I may come back to you on the Pall-Mall process, in fact, and whether there's a fundamental question on whether this kind of multi-stakeholderism or this multi-stakeholder approach might be the answer. And if so, how can initiatives like the Pall-Mall process or the US Joint Declaration that we've mentioned before become more successful when it comes to enforcement? And lastly, if I may add on, you mentioned the great work of civil society organizations there. Is there a role for civil society in helping strengthen fundamental rights safeguards in these contexts?
Great, there's a lot there. And so let me say on the Pall-Mall process, I mean, I'm completely in favor and think it can be really valuable for states to, come up with these statements that promote fundamental rights in the context of surveillance. I mean, nothing wrong with that at all. I do think, though, that we need to be careful or clear about what is meant first by multi-stakeholder engagement and what is meant by the obligations or the responsibilities, let's say, under the UN guiding principles. So on multi-stakeholder, I think it's absolutely essential, given the fact that civil society has been, and by civil society, I mean not just human rights organizations and academic institutions, but also journalists, have been so essential in uncovering the scandals of spyware that they should also be a part of the process of, if not legislating, because that's why we have legislators, at least being a part of the conversation about what responses to spyware make the most sense, are most protective of human rights, what are the forensic tools that should be shared, within civil society and so forth. So I think there's a lot of room for states to be even more open about civil society participation. They've been pretty good. I mean, the US Summit for Democracy process, Pall-Mall process to a certain extent, they have integrated, I mean, the PEGA committee was, I think, pretty extraordinary in inviting civil society to provide testimony. Those kinds of things I think are important, and we should think of those as part of the kind of multi-stakeholder input. On the UN guiding principles, because I think those are mentioned in a couple of, certainly in the Pall-Mall process and in other ones. So the UN guiding principles, they work on the basis of a few different pillars, right? States have duties to protect, and companies or private businesses have responsibilities to respect human rights. And occasionally some of the spyware companies, and this is certainly true of NSO Group, will say, we embrace the UN guiding principles. We are happy to implement those responsibilities, and not only that, but you don't need to regulate us so much because we're going to do it through that process. And that's, frankly, nonsense. The UN guiding principles are really valuable in providing a structure for how to think about state responsibility to protect third parties. And they're really valuable for providing a set of principles for how private business should behave. But in the context of spyware, self-regulation is basically a non-starter. I mean, to give it to give us another example, in the context of private military contractors, right? There was a kind of robust effort to involve, private contractors to involve them in a kind of public-private conversation about how to restrain and hold accountable private military contractors, and that was pretty valuable, and it emerged, and you had a code of conduct. You still have a code of conduct. You had the Swiss government sort of organizing the development of an organization around this. That's all really good, and those private military contractors that joined it basically, I think, were understood to do so in good faith. I'm not sure we can expect that in the spyware context, especially given what we already know about so many of the companies that have kind of run really rough over human rights and national security standards. So I think that if we're thinking about something as these principles do of UN guiding principles, we should really be focused on the first pillar, which is state responsibility, state duty to protect, rather than, company responsibilities. So that's sort of a reaction to some of those things. Again, I don't think those processes are sort of negative. I mean, they're good to have these kinds of conversations, but we should just be clear about what we're talking about when we're talking about multi-stakeholderism or government company responsibility in a UN guiding principles context.
Could I just
Sorry,
quickly,
very quick.
Thank you so much, Asha, and thank you, David. I agree as always with all of those points. I just really wanted to clarify to actually clarify the agreement on that. When I talked about what I was talking about is how in the regulatory space. So, for example, we have the dual use regulation, we have others. That then years ago, when some of them were initially thought up, we weren't as far along with that concept of due diligence and what it means for states and companies. So I think I totally agree with you. I think we still can take inspiration from both the OECD guidelines, from the UN guiding principles, and also from some of the conversations that have been had in the EU around corporate due diligence more generally. But I just to confirm that I really agree that we clearly are we're at a moment in time where it's clear that that due diligence has to be in a regulatory fashion and not a voluntary one.
Thank you for that clarification. And you raised several concrete examples there of country initiatives. And I actually wanted to come back to Sophie on this question on the Pall Mall process, if I may, because most EU member states have actually signed up to this, with the exception of Hungary and Spain. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on this question as well, about the kind of Pall Mall process, and maybe even thinking about it in the juxtaposition to what you highlighted about the political will within the EU context.
Yes, I'm afraid I don't have very specific comments on that specific process. And I also have to say, I'm not a cynic by nature, but I do believe that we should be a little less naive about what is at stake here. I think was it Anna or Verna? I can't remember who said it, but we said it also very clearly in our report. In a way, this is much less a privacy or data protection issue or human rights issue than it is an issue of democracy and security. And if we focus only on human rights, I mean, again, we can regulate all we like, but member states or governments are just going to say, okay, well, but this doesn't apply because this is about national security. And to show you how how important this issue of political will is. David rightfully said that at some point the US understood that this was an issue of national security because their people might have been targeted, or look at what happened in the European Union. Members of the European Parliament have been targeted repeatedly for a wide range of reasons. Most recently, they've been targeted with Pegasus, the chair and members of the Defense Committee. And what happened? Nothing. Even the president of the European Parliament has been targeted. Okay, it was, it failed, and nothing happens. No reaction. It's all swept under the carpet. And you know why that is? Because there have been phone calls from the national governments saying, you're not going to address this. This has to stay quiet. Because of course it would have been very easy at this point in time to pick up the phone, call the Israeli authorities and NSO and say, we've been targeted with Pegasus, you're selling this stuff, you're issuing export licenses, you know exactly who has been using this, you know the phone numbers that have been targeted. So it should be easy enough to find out who's behind this. So clearly the will to find out is lacking. That means that even if we as European Parliament, as European Union are being targeted, there is no reaction. Why? Because then the national governments would have to actually admit that they have to regulate, and they would have to come clean about, the use and the exports and the trade in spyware. And so you see how strong their will is to keep freedom to use the stuff, because that's what's at stake. This is about power and nothing else. It's not about violating somebody's privacy. It's about power. And they're never, ever going to voluntarily give up the power. They're never, ever going to voluntarily tie their own hands. They're not doing it. That requires external pressure. And that's why, and this is the bind we're in, because external pressure comes from scrutiny, from parliamentary oversight, from independent oversight, from judicial oversight, from media scrutinizing, from accountability. And that's exactly what has been weakened dramatically, including by the use of spyware. So, as to the US acting, yes, but let's not be too starry-eyed about this. We also know that this is targeting only certain spyware vendors of commercial spyware. It doesn't mean they're not using it. Huh? They've got their own stuff. So, and this is of course specific for the European Union, where most of the member states don't have the capability of developing their own stuff, so they have to buy it on the market. So it's all very well for the US to take this initiative, but they're not dependent on NSO or Intellexa. But to also give you an idea of how determined the EU member state governments are to not discuss this, is the fact that a company like Intellexa has not just been blacklisted, but sanctioned by the US authorities. And in the European Union, it sort of gets a VIP treatment. I mean, we can talk forever about the solutions that are possible. We know what the solutions are. That's not the problem. And most of them have been listed in the Parliament resolution, and there are all these other initiatives. The big obstacle to solving this problem is political, I'm afraid. And I'm not saying, I'm an optimist. I think it will be solved one day. But it's very difficult because governments are giving themselves the power to basically eliminate scrutiny and opposition. So, and until that realization is beginning to dawn on the population, and until people start, voting into office governments which are actually attached to democracy, i.e., democracy is not about elections. Democracy is about checks on power. That's the essence of democracy. So if governments are eliminating the checks on power, then it's democracy which is being jeopardized. And this, I think, is really crucial to put it in that frame, rather than talking about, we have to talk about human rights. I mean, I think most of you know me. I've been fighting for privacy and data protection for the last 20 years, like a maniac. So, I'm deeply attached to that. But it shouldn't be the focus of our efforts here, because what's at stake is democracy. Because without scrutiny, without checks and balances, without accountability, there is no democracy. Then elections only become, it's like elections in Russia. They have elections, but it's not a democracy.
Thank you so much.
In short, about all these initiatives, that's why I don't want to respond to it too much, because for me, it's not solving the issue. It's not getting to the core of the issue.
Thank you for those. And I mean, you touched on several points there, but I really wanted to pull out your point on democracy, the functioning of democracy, and about accountability and accountability actors in that context. I think all of you have touched upon the exemplary work of civil society, and I will use the word exemplary here, of civil society in kind of highlighting, exposing these issues, what's been happening, those rights violations. And despite multiple calls from civil society, and of course, as we've seen in the PEGA committee report and others, and knowing what those solutions are, we know that, of course, that meaningful progress at EU level remains elusive. And I think political will has been mentioned several times here. And it has prompted civil society to take more of a leading role in advocating for those kind of human rights protective approaches. So we have many civil society colleagues joining us here today on the webinar and following our live stream. And so I wanted to open up the floor to them to start sending us in their questions for our panelists. But before we come to those questions, I wanted to ask all of you what your reflections are specifically on this civil society question. What is the role of civil society in driving these reforms forward on this very important issue, very much taking into consideration the context that you've all highlighted that we're operating in? And I will just go democratically based on who's on my screen first. So Werner, I come to you first.
Thank you, Asha. And a lot of our work at the Office of High Commissioner is actually on this whole issue of civic space as well. So I'm thinking of that as I answer that question. What first strikes me is I think civil society have had to already do too much. It is thanks to civil society efforts in the first place that we even know that this was happening, that the scandals were happening. Some of you that know me know that I was actually working at Amnesty International years ago before this. And, I actually, with the phone that I had, I never actually did the forensic testing myself, but I know I was stepping on a lot of toes from a lot of powerful governments. And so I just think that that's also, it's actually indicative of the problem that the burden, and it is a bigger burden from civil society because of the higher danger and risks that they're exposed to, have done that extraordinary work. So I think that also places a higher burden on both on institutions and states as well, to say now that civil society has cast a light on that. And at the same time, because of the expertise in civil society, because of that ability and that forensic knowledge, it is essential that civil society is given meaningful participation and spotlight. And as David mentioned, I think it was rather exemplary that civil society was given such a voice in the PEGA inquiry. So I think it's be really, really essential that there's the really meaningful participation for civil society in measures that are taken, but also somewhat a lifting of the burden. We need states to step up to have those oversight and accountability mechanisms that many colleagues have talked about. That burden itself should not fall disproportionately on civil society actors, despite the fact that, as I said, it's thanks to those efforts that we're even having this conversation today, frankly.
Thank you for the recognition of the extensive work that civil society has done and that you've contributed to over the time. But Anna, I also wanted to come to you with your reflections. I know that the EDPS often calls on civil society inputs as in the development of things like opinions and reflections that you do. What do you think civil society could do here?
Well, I think Verna already explained that the civil society has been particularly active in this space. So I think in terms of not dropping the issue, but finding new ways to explain to the public why this is a problem that needs to be addressed in a comprehensive manner is extremely important. And frankly, I do not really see any other place from where this could come than civil society. So I certainly commend you for organizing this event and giving this topic already quite some visibility, and hopefully this work will continue here and elsewhere. But on our side as EDPS, we also try to keep the topic alive. So obviously, there are strong connections between privacy, the rights to privacy and data and personal data protection. I mean, they are not serving only themselves; they are also at the service of many other freedoms, freedom of expression, possibility to dissent, to implement checks and balances. And ultimately also rule of law and democracy as recognized by international bodies, by the Venice Commission. There are many links between regulations of privacy and how well functioning is democracy and rule of law in particular jurisdictions. So from this perspective, we will be celebrating our 20 years with our own event on the 20th of June. And in that context, I will have the pleasure of moderating a panel on precisely the intersection between national security, democracy, rule of law, and independent oversight in particular. It will not focus exclusively on spyware and similar technologies, but on national security related activities in the sphere of privacy electronic communications, obviously, but hopefully that would also be a contribution to this debate from our end, hoping to keep the topic important and alive, and also pass the message to the new European Parliament and the future European Commission that there is also something that they should be doing in this space.
Thank you so much, Anna. And David, I wanted to come to you with a question, but it actually ties in extremely well to one of the questions that we've received in our chat from our colleagues over at Data Rights, connected to civil society participation. So regarding the Pall Mall and the US initiative, yes, these initiatives are interesting, but civil society has restricted resources, and we are, of course, operating in an increasing shrinking space. Do you expect that these initiatives will be worthwhile for civil society to invest their capacity in? And what can civil society obtain from these processes?
That's a great question. And I think it's absolutely important to highlight that civil society can't do everything, and government can't simply sort of outsource some of, either the analysis or the advocacy to civil society. That's not sort of feasible for civil society to take on that kind of responsibility. And it's also, it's not the way the democratic process should work. I mean, a couple of things. One is, I think the community of civil society advocates and researchers on this topic in particular has been, here I'll use the word exemplary, in organizing, coordinating, trying to divide up responsibility for different aspects of this debate. And so if you look at civil society's organization, you have some that are doing tremendous forensic work that can only be done by, a few organizations with real capacity to do that. And then you have other organizations that are doing a lot of the, for example, interaction with, the members of the European Parliament and the PEGA committee, or with the US government and others. I mean, there's overlap, but because this community of advocates and researchers is, I think, a pretty cohesive group, they're working together on a lot of these things. And I would suggest to any civil society organization that wants to be a part of that to simply reach out. I mean, could probably reach out to you or to me or to any of the other organizations and just, express an interest in being part of the conversation. And is it worth it? Because the question is sort of like, is it worth it to engage? I think it's important to be a part of sort of the advocacy effort, and then to figure out, given the kind of organization that you are, where can you make the biggest difference? What gap are you filling that others might not be able to address at the moment?
Thank you, David. And I hope that answers your question there, Lena, but of course, some valuable insights there that you'll be able to pick through later. But just to come to another question, and Sophie, I think this question is specifically for you, and being conscious of time, I'm going to go through the questions as promptly as I can. So there's a couple of questions here about the EU sphere. One in particular about why do EU member states seem willing, in your opinion, to go further on the international plane than within the remit of the EU in particular, and thinking about how certain EU member states, or certain states in general, have recently changed course when it comes to pursuing more spyware regulation. But if I may come to you on that first question there about the disparity between EU member state willingness within the EU and in the external international fora from your perspective.
Well, I think the simple answer is probably because it would be less binding. You know, if they have EU legislation, there's this whole, you have the Court of Justice and then and Parliament, and it's just it would be more inconvenient for them. So and whatever the outcome of the international initiatives is going to be, I can already tell you it will not mean that all of a sudden EU member state governments are going to be subject to much stricter rules than they are, or scrutiny rather, than they are now, because they clearly don't, you know, they don't have that intention. So they're whatever they're, I think it's a bit of window dressing, and probably meant or targeting non-EU governments rather than themselves. I don't think they're going to voluntarily subject to much stricter regulations and controls. I mean, they could, you know, they've had every opportunity in the world of doing that, and they're not doing it. So, you know, I don't think they will.
Thank you. We have just a couple of minutes left, so I will just take just one final question, possibly two if we have the time. We do have a question from our friends over at Access Now, who have been mentioned for their great work in this area too. So legally speaking, given that EU officials have been targeted, does that not give the institution the jurisdiction to immediately act on this issue? Can they ban certain companies, especially foreign ones like NSO, in this context? And maybe Sophie and Anna, I'll come to you for very, very brief reflections on that question.
Okay, on jurisdiction, you'd really have to ask a lawyer, but obviously any person with common sense would understand that, you know, if the Commission or the European Parliament have been targeted, that obviously everything should be mobilized in order to find out what happened. And what we have seen is exactly the opposite. They have gone out of their way to downplay it, to sweep it under the carpet, to be as intransparent as possible. I mean, we never got any information about, we got very little information about official information about what happened inside the Commission, where we know from other sources that there have been probably dozens of people who've been targeted. And maybe not all attempts have been equally successful, but it has been attempted. And if it was, again, each time Pegasus was used, you know, we should have made a phone call to NSO in Israel. Israel is supposed to be an ally still, you know, and they are actually facilitating actors spying on EU institutions. And if Israel and NSO are complying with the rules, then the number of actors who could actually be using Pegasus is limited. You know, and they know who is using it against members of the European Parliament or the Commission. So if the political will is there to find out, then they could have found out. If the European Commission had the political will to, let's say, to really investigate and make public who they believe is behind it, they could have done so, but they didn't, because everybody suspected that it was either Poland or Hungary. So that would have been very embarrassing. You know, one or even more of the EU member states, and don't forget that the government leaders are all together in the European Council, which is a very powerful body. No, I find this, how should I put it? If you look at other policy areas like migration, for example, there the European Union is acting the whole time outside treaties, in the absence of any legal basis. I mean, like the Turkey deal, the Tunisia deal, what do we have now? The Egypt deal, the Lebanon deal. They're all, you know, I always like to say they have the same legal status as a beer coaster. And nobody cares because they want it to happen. The political will is there. So I am not advocating for EU action without a legal basis. Don't get me wrong, but this whole you know, the European Commission going, we have no powers, we have no competence. We couldn't possibly, you know, exceed our competences. It means they don't want to. They're seeking the limits of their power the whole time. And in this area, all of a sudden they go like, we cannot do this. The European Parliament itself, I mean, it was a massive scandal, and rightfully so, when it was found out that Qatar and Morocco were trying to unduly influence decision-making in the European Parliament by bribing people. So why isn't it the same scandal when somebody is trying to unduly influence our work through spying? How is that different? And yet, you know, the one was it's been dominating our debates for months. And when it comes about members of the European Parliament being targeted, and I'm not talking about, let's say, the Catalans or the Greeks, you know, the people who we know were targeted by their own governments, but Roberta Metsola, so the president of the European Parliament, the chair of the Defense Committee, the chair of the Fisheries Committee, it gets the silence treatment. It's amazing.
Thank you, Sophie. And I did want to ask Anna, as the lawyer of this question on jurisdiction. We are at time, though. So I don't know if, Anna, if you could just tell us in 1 or 2 sentences in an answer to that question, whether the institutions actually have jurisdiction to act over this issue.
I will try to be as brief as possible. I mean, Sophie again was talking to the political will, and let's say, you know, any investigations that could be done outside the scope of a formal criminal procedure. The EU as such, it does have Europol, it now does have the European Public Prosecutor's Office, but to my knowledge, neither of them has any jurisdiction comparable to a national police force or prosecutor's office in situations such as suspicion of hacking or other breaches of applicable law. So for that, complaints should be filed with competent national authorities, just as the case of, you know, theft or any other problems, any other criminal occurrence that might happen on the territory of the EU institutions, whether based in Strasbourg, Brussels, or Luxembourg, or elsewhere. And so I would hope that that has been done, at least in some cases, and I would encourage those who have been victimized by these type of attacks to make sure that they have filed complaints with a national competent authority in their member state, or possibly in the state of the seat of the institution, and then hopefully that will run its course, and hopefully some of these procedures are already ongoing. But indeed, in terms of actual jurisdiction or even institutions or bodies that would be empowered to perform these type of roles for the EU institutions, we don't really have them.
Thank you for that very concrete answer with clear procedural guidance also for the national level there. So that does bring us to the end of our event today. And I just want to thank our panelists so much for their expertise and their insights. I've taken so much away from this conversation, and I hope many of you have too. I think it's clear that after the election and the incoming Commission and Parliament, the work must be rekindled of the PEGA committee in particular, and the next EU institutions do bear the responsibility for ensuring that the use of spyware is curtailed and fundamental rights are respected. For CDT Europe, we believe that the European institutions absolutely must do better. I think that's clear from the conversations we've had today. So it is imperative that the Commission and the Council in particular do act urgently upon the recommendations of the PEGA committee, because this really is a matter of upholding the trust that people place in political institutions. So once again, I would like to thank our distinguished panelists for sharing their insights with us today, to our civil society partners for their collaboration, and to all of you who joined us online in the webinar and on our live stream for today's discussion. Thank you all once again. This is not the end of the conversation. We will be speaking again soon, we hope, on this discussion. And thank you and have a great day.